Bueno, buenos días, bienvenidas y bienvenidos al...
Morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth event of the week for tax policy and human rights, where we will be talking about learnings of feminist experience to go towards a better tax justice through tax collection that promotes women justice and other groups that have been excluded, and as well as people in risk of being discriminated, Afro-descendant people, people with disabilities. So talking about the international system of human rights, principles 5 and 6 of the documents that we will be introducing this week, disclose the principles on non-exclusion and progressivity, among others, in respect of tax policy. Particularly, Principle 6 establishes that states should promote substantial equality of gender through a tax policy with intersectionality point of view. It starts from the point of view that tax policy have gender bias, and beside identifying them, states should take concrete measures to correct them. The right to equality and non-discrimination encompass two concepts: a negative compass related to the prohibition of having arbitrary treatment, and the other one is related to state obligation to create real equity or substantial treatment, ensure access to media services, utilities, and basic services for people to live in dignity and autonomy. That's one of the main values and paradigms of human rights. For this, the positive concept of equity requires affirmative actions on people of a group that have suffered of structural disadvantages, such as women and other gender identities that live in poverty, for example. In order to reach this leveling, necessary measures would mean focalized policies or larger dimensions in services destined for this group, all the way to tax reduction on some assets or services, or reforms in some taxes that disproportionately affect these populations. This is why the principles that we will be introducing this week propose to introduce and unravel a generic format such as the substantial equity into specific measures that allow to move forward a just society with real distributed justice. With this debate, we want to debate and discuss the idea that state tool is only public spending, because we see that the persistence of this idea has been omitted, and it's still omitting at some point tax aspects to reduce inequality in a context of poverty and inequality situation that disproportionately affect women and other gender identities. To this, we add that available information on income and wealth distribution mention that gender inequality is seen very clearly in tax policy, and it does not achieve an equal distribution, but that affects the lower socioeconomic levels where women, children, and other groups that have been historically excluded are overrepresented. So in order to think about reforms needed and how to instrument them, and without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel members that we have invited to start this debate. First, we will have Gracielle David. She is coordinator of campaign and global policy of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Then we will have Veronica Serafini. She is coordinator of tax and gender of Latin American Caribbean Tax Justice Association and member of Latindad. Then you will have Alba Ramirez Rodriguez, and she is part of the group for a development of a new era, done for her the English term. And then you will have Nicole Videgaray Ponte. She is official of social affairs of the Division of Gender Issues in ECLAC. So to start, I would like to pass the floor to Gracielle, and I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you so much, Julieta. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to participate in this activity. Let me tell you that I am going to be speaking in Portuguese. My presentation is going to be in Portuguese, although the presentation is in Spanish. So I'm just telling you that we will have an icon represented by a globe that lets you choose in which language you want to hear, Portuguese, Spanish, or English. So now I'm going to speak in Portuguese once I let you know. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today and to be able to talk to you today after so many years of working to build these principles of human rights in tax policy. And I'm so glad to participate in this situation with aim to discuss tax policies. This is a job that relates to human rights and women's rights. I'm going to tell a little bit about the Global Alliance, what type of work we do, and I would also like to offer you a new document that aims to show people that work and collaborated to provide input in these principles and how we included this in our campaigns as part of the Global Alliance. Here we know the Global Alliance is a coalition of tax justice, and what we do is that at a national level, we do campaigns for progressive and redistributive tax systems in order to reach a tax governance that's transparent, inclusive, representative, and global. Here, I believe that the main campaign that the Alliance created many years ago was by a tax organ that was part of the UN to be able to talk about these international tax efforts. It's something that's done between the richest countries of the OECD, but not only them, but also those who have a right within the UN. So the time has come. We've had some progress, especially with a panel that has been created and a document has been introduced at the UN to reach this international tax governance. So Global Alliance was created in 2013 in Lima, Peru, and has 6 regions in Asia. We have the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, in Africa, Tax Justice Network Africa, in Latin America, the Tax Justice Network for Latin America and Caribbean. Veronica will tell us a little bit more about it. And this is one of the organizations that starts this initiative in human rights for tax policy. In Europe, we have Tax Justice Europe. In North America, we have Canadian for Tax Fairness and Fact Coalition. And all of these networks represent hundreds of organizations. So as I mentioned before, the Network for Tax Justice is one of the organizations that participate and are part of the initiative. And within the Global Alliance, besides having these networks, this work, we also have an aspect that we have stressed on. The fact that a movement is being created, campaigns are happening, alliances. So this is something that has been acknowledged even with the assignment of the alliance that has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize along with the International Consortium on Investigative Journalists. Now, this alliance has already received another award, and the main steps to build this are the working groups. The main working groups that we have today is the Tax and Gender Work Group that was established in 2016 in order to provide a space for everyone, whether it's organizations, researchers, to share their activities and directly involve in campaigns, generate documents. It has members of more than 30 countries. We have also collective actions with the UN, the IMF, World Bank. We also collect funding, and we create funding for special projects. Right now, we have one that's called GAIN Project that has the main goal of generating feminist organizations in the south part of the continent so that organizations can be more involved in tax justice matters and to carry out tax justice campaigns for women's rights. So what's this campaign? Well, we know that it's very important for this working group. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what we've been doing in 2021. We already had the 5th edition. It was a global and national level and field. There were many requests. So we know that challenges could be more particular per region, but even so, these are matters that affect all of us, especially the need of changing this domain or these fields in some particular countries of the OECD, and tax abuse that different multinational companies commit, and how will all of this affect women's rights, or also not to use public budget in the right way. How can we create basis movements are on the streets? Of course, there are complicated situations, and of course, it was necessary to adapt with the pandemic. We had a digital pandemic, digital adapting, for example, to the pandemic, and the important thing is to go back and manifest out on the streets, to demonstrate, and also to go back to international incidents presence, because we want to have conversations and dialogues. The representative of the Global Alliance, you can see her on screen, she's Caroline Otim. She's also with us today. And well, today she is in a resting period. However, I'm representing her today. I just want to say that she has done a great lobbying job. We had examples of influence, and we have March 2019. Before the pandemic, she was in New York in the UN. In March 21, online during a UN event, she worked with them. And also, these are all of the requests that we are addressing. 5 requests that we're addressing, which is guaranteeing tax and fiscal policies so that they reduce, represent, and redistribute non-paid work, including the creation of national policies of work, of care for others. And the other is reducing tax burden that are unfair on women, and adopt progressive tax collection, which is distributed, and gender equality, which is not frequently seen in Latin America. And eliminate any difference, for example, in terms of gender discrimination, public policy to guarantee that this collection is given the way it should be. We need to establish a global tax organization before the UN so that we can guarantee tax rights in all of the countries, and we can stop tax abuse in all of the countries in need. Here we have more campaigns that have been carried out in Bangladesh, Nepal, in Mexico. And our working group here, just to conclude, this is a document that has been generated as a part of our working group. This is gender and tax collection. We have drafted this document that's about to be published. It is called Framing Feminist Tax Collection. This is the work framework. This is an example that we use for Uganda, but it's also being broadly used, including the work of the Global Alliance on gender tax collection. And here, of course, we discuss tax policy matters with the gender perspective and human rights perspective. We also have the SSR that participated in the drafting of this document that's about to be launched in the next couple of days. And it has a feminist perspective for tax collection, and especially now that we are talking about these principles. So I just ask you to go over our network to be able to know a little bit more about this document. Thank you so much for your attention. This is my contact info in case you need any further information. Thank you. Thank you so much, Graciela. It is very interesting to see what you have been working on, framework, feminist tax collection in Uganda. I think it would be amazing if we had a little bit more time when we were done, so that with the rest of the panelists, so you can tell us a little bit how you're doing on advocacy, so you can truly work on these proposals. Now I would like to pass the floor to Veronica Serafini. Thank you so much, Julieta. Well, I think that the title of the presentation are learnings. So I think that in tax policy, in terms of income, we have had a lot of progress in the last years, especially in three fields. First, questioning the idea that policies are neutral, and especially the fact that tax policies are neutral in terms of gender. The second, breakthrough generating abilities and capacities in collective work. Gracel already showed one part, and there's also others that are being done with feminist movements. On one part, we have instruments, studies, and also working groups. And this is a very important event which will allow us to disseminate. And the third aspect is also dismantling narratives, because in terms of tax policies, there are already statements done and elements considered as a given. For example, in terms of gender, subsidies are negative in poor populations. But when we talk about, for example, subsidies to corporations or to large greatest resources populations, then we tell people that these are incentives, right? Not subsidies. So we need to eliminate this mindset, because at the end of the day, tax systems are built as of the ideas that people have. And if citizens do not recognize their rights, then they cannot fight for them. And of course, states capturings and the role of tax systems that just benefit them, the state. So if we compare them, well, the feminist movement and the feminist community has had a lot of progress and even big steps forward, non-neutral policies in terms of spending. And I think that today it is not further argued that social investment, public investment is not neutral. And this same effort is being done by us today in tax matters, because as you very well said at the beginning, the redistributive effect of spending has limits. When they collect little and they collect unfairly, unjustly, with that overload of indirect taxes, then many times it neutralizes the distribution generated for spending. And it neutralizes even further in moments of great debt, which is the one that we are going through today. Because keeping sustainability of debt or guaranteeing debt sustainability in all crisis periods has proven that progress achieved by women revert, with all of the effort that they've done in terms of spending. So we not only need to consider the tax system as part of tax policies and as part of spending and as part of debt policies and austerity that comes behind it. So in this austerity, tax systems are reinforced, and not only spending is reduced, but also more taxes are generated, indirect taxes. And the learning that we've had in these couple of years from feminist economy and feminist movements has been proving that tax policy also has gender bias, especially in the case of Latin America. Most of taxes are collected via indirect taxes and not via direct taxes over people and over corporations. And I believe that we have had a lot of progress here, incorporating the situation in complex and hard debates. For example, financial flows, illegal ones, and the impact they have in reducing resources that women need to finance their rights. A very practical example of this is the case of feminine products management that are considered basic for women and, however, they pay indirect taxes for this, and this makes it harder for women and for domestic economies. This is a tax system collecting little, which affects women's rights and prevents progressiveness of rights, and not local tax collection is not the only problem, also unfair tax collection. When the VAT has to be paid, or when the personal income taxes are designed for high, for the developed classes, or then it's hard to pay it. When we focus on indirect taxes, women are fundamentally in disadvantage. It's harder for them than for the upper classes, which makes it unfair. When, for example, we don't have resources and we fall in debt, we talk about feasible infrastructure, or we don't think about a care infrastructure. However, when we have to pay that debt with low collection tax systems and indirect taxes on women, then the disproportionate payment of debt falls on women again. So we're trying to see how, in a comprehensive way, this affects and feeds back those disadvantages, preventing women's rights to be guaranteed by the state. And in this sense, we are also considering not only practice from theory or from the formulas of economic orthodoxy. This means debt sustainability, especially when we talk about what feminist economy vindicates as sustainability of abilities and skills. What is the impact that we face when there are no tax resources, or when they are collected unfairly in a context of women's stagnancy in terms of inequality? No one can deny that women, despite progress, are still showing unequal indicators in terms of health, education, employment with social security, unprotected development. A huge percentage of women, and crisis has already proven this, the health crisis has proven this, a huge percentage of women are at home without social security coverage, and pandemic lockdowns affected them the most. Many women stopped working. They started being not unpaid workers in the family, in family entrepreneurships, but without them being paid. So women are workers in the market, but without any income, and that's also being reflected. So these problems deserve more funding, and especially fair funding. That's why we need to look at tax systems at the same time, with the same consideration used for the other side of tax situation, which is spending, but in an indebtedness context, that's going to put this in a counter position that will generate, and austerity policies will generate setbacks and a tax systems that's probably more unjust in years to come. There's a huge challenge from this perspective, and I think that this challenge has to be addressed from the citizenship and popular parts, because they are the main affected ones when we talk about tax policy. It is not only a macro indicator here, but they have a direct effect on conditions and quality of life, and especially on the rights of women and their possibility of emancipation. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Veronica. I think that both presentations are showing that there is a huge challenge to dismantle this narrative, and in some way they still perpetuate rooted myths on who provide their input, who are benefited by state investments, and in some way principles aim to dispute these narratives. But our main challenge, I think, is still to, apart from visibilizing this tax problem, is also showing that the state is not doing their job. We need to try to think public policy proposals that allow to revert those biases, as of going over all of the systems that promote unequal situations. There are some examples, some experiences that can allow us to consider and include popular sectors, as Veronica said. So we can think on how to incorporate intersectionality and a greater participation of communities that are truly affected. Having said this, I would like to pass the floor to Corina. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizations that have organized this week and this meeting in particular. It's a pleasure to be part of Act Collectively. I wanted to share two comments. The first one is a reflection on the lessons learned and what we've won. And I am also going to revisit something that Graciela and Veronica have already mentioned. And the second part, bringing Argentina's example to the table, I find some opportunities there to move forward with gender agenda. The first thing I'd like to say is that for these principles discussed today to effectively turn in non-discrimination warranties and substantial equality, true equality, I think that part of the power that it would bring, turning this into concrete actions, is doing it from justice, from tax justice, from gender justice. I think that feminist vision is the one that guarantees that we are not going to only be considering the existence of gaps and gender biases, but that the idea here is create a transforming agenda that moves forward simultaneously on socioeconomic justice and gender justice, which limits are kind of blurry. And in this sense, I think that the challenge that we are facing and that we've been working on, and what my colleagues have already said, I think it's a great example of this. We are facing two simultaneous challenges that on one side, well, the cross-sectionality of the feminist agenda in economic policy plays a role, and also the economic agenda cross-sectionally in the feminist agenda. And this cross-linking is the one that has allowed us to move forward until now. I think that it's exactly there where we can identify some progress and where both things have been articulated. The feminist vision in the economic vision in economic policies, but also the cross-sectionality of economic aspects in the feminist agenda. And I'd like to mention some milestones from what Veronica and Graciela have said. One is generating evidence, and this has already been mentioned by Veronica, and that has been key. We've been for more than 1 decade producing analyses, information that has generated further questions. And I think that this is key in order to make the agenda move forward. I think that the other milestone has been the work of a discussion between the academia and activism and creating material that goes beyond studies and analysis that are in reduced spaces. So here, one example could be 2017's Bogota Declaration. That's one of the conversations, and it is still a very good principle declaration. And what do we aspire when we talk about gender justice and tax justice? And I think that this progress in discussion between academia and activism and starting to show the transforming agenda that we are aiming for in concretely brings in turn concrete actions. So my colleagues already mentioned how, for example, in the case of Colombia's tax reform, not the current one, the one in 2018, where in the framework of this discussion on tax reform, we were able to bring to the table a tax collection to menstrual products that at the end of the day were not able to remove taxes on the framework of the reform, but afterwards with a judicial action. So I think that this is a very concrete example on how can we bring concrete problems and how we can effectively, in tax matters, we can also solve situations that very concretely affect people's lives, and how in the midst of a tax conversation and discussion, Colombian friends were able to discuss social reproduction and the injustice of this cost to be only paid by women. I think that another milestone is the one that we're going through today in this health crisis, in this pandemic caused by the COVID, because I think that this context has bring a new point of view, a renewed point of view on inequality, because it has exposed it very fluently, very eloquently, and it has recovered the discussion that starts from this agenda, which is the need for wealth to pay the bill. You know, for those who are rich or rich people pay the bill of this crisis. And they have started appearing, you know, new proposals for tax reforms or specific tax reforms to the wealthiest people on the planet. So I think that in this framework, also the second element that the pandemic brought to us was visibilizing the essential sectors of the economy. I think that today, at least in Latin America, it is quite powerful, you know, discourse in favor of investment care, because care became essential, or it has already been visibilized how essential it was. I mean, at the end of the day, and what we've been working on all of these years is imposing this idea. You know, how profitable it could be economically speaking investing in care, and that investing in care necessarily will bring us to discuss how to finance this investment, this specific type of investment. So what has been useful in this time? I think that this vision from rights and justice have been quite useful. I mean, it has been great and helpful to have a broad vision on the matter, and also articulating agendas has been very useful. The case of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice that Graciele just discussed, the case of the group of tax and gender on the Global Alliance, I think that this is a very powerful example on how agenda articulation and how to cross-sectionalize feminist agenda in social agenda can produce tools and strategies that end up being quite effective. I think that something that Veronica mentioned has also been quite useful, which is educating ourselves in this matter, educating feminists, educating activists in these matters. Then we have a lot of feminist economy education examples. In Latin America, I think that this is truly expanding, you know, the education in feminist economy in academic environments, but also activist education. There are feminist economy schools from different organizations that are educating, instructing feminist activists in these matters. And I think that this is starting to show good results. And also developing specific tools that Veronica already mentioned. There are some tools to consider taxes matters, but maybe there are also more tools to consider budgets. And these tools have been quite useful for a citizen monitoring on budgets that could also generate a process of citizen monitorship, not only on expenses, but also on collection. And also, what I wanted to discuss from the Argentinian context is that another key aspect to move forward in this agenda is involving feminists in public policy management and in institutions. Nicole will be showing how useful it has been to pick our brains, from gender division on ECLAC. Also, other divisions at ECLAC had worked on the same topic because they cannot evade anymore gender dimensions in their proposals and before then in the analysis tax related. So public policy here is opening also opportunities for this. And here I go to the most representing aspect in Argentina. And with this, I want to share the experiences that we've had here. I think that in Argentina's case, we've shown how powerful it is to expand movement and feminist agenda and involving feminists in public policy management and the alliance that has to last between feminists entering into management and the feminist movement. In this sense, in Argentina, national direction has been created on economy, equality, and gender in the Ministry of Economy that I find as a powerful example that hopefully can be reproduced in other countries, because this is a direction, a directorate that is within the Ministry of Economy that does a permanent job of monitoring policies and economic information management. Also in Argentina, we have a gender and tax collection project in the country's Ministry of Tax Collection, because there's a feminist there that wants to move forward with this topic, and that has created a working group at the core of design and management of tax policies. So I think that all of this work that we've been doing in years is quite valuable. The budget on tax perspective that has been done in civil society and that has also been a very active part has brought us to have in Argentina a public budget with a gender perspective, with a methodology that's can be further perfected, yes, but that can generate synergies. And part of this has to do, of course, with demand that we have today in Argentina from provinces, so we can train people on taxes with gender perspective. So this is an example on how to open roads and the need that there is for external trends in the people that move forward this every day. And last but not least, I wanted to show two things. One is that in Argentina, we are starting to build a national care system. An interministerial care roundtable has been created, and I find it very important to have the Ministry of Economy and the Agency of Public Collection to be members of this. Discussion on funding is settled. It's sat on the same table where we're discussing how we are going to implement these policies. And I think this is a great example of processes that could open for these opportunities. And I think that last but not least, the construction, even if it's controversial, of statements in favor of equality programs and how we can fund this investment that's going to have a return with feminists policies. I conclude by saying that these windows of opportunities that are open when a government works with an open mind with the feminist agendas and when feminists included in this decision making from academia and from activism is also important. And it is also important to always have this reality because, of course, in Argentina, there are examples of, in the framework of the pandemic in Argentina, there was an attempt to impose a wealth tax imposition that ended up saying, we are in these pandemic situations. Please, Mr. and Mrs. Rich people, could you help us with this? This is a great example of the barriers that we are facing when we want to see a transforming agenda that increases public resources, that, of course, affects tax policy. And in this sense, I think that discussions are quite there in terms on how we create power so we can create resistance of power from those who have been part of the privileges that have been expressed in the current tax system. So all of these success and activities such as these encounters will help us create this power that I'm convinced, as Veronica already said, that's going to be more powerful when people see how this impacts our daily life and limits the exercise of our rights. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Corina. So, yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that I'm convinced that expansion and involvement of feminists is the result of this movement. And this care intersectionality that was created in Argentina and other federal tables that are trying to design policies with a gender focus involving provinces, involving the Ministry of Economy. This is a great example of something that we are proposing, or that's something that it's unavoidable in those ideas. So reforms and the new design of fiscal or tax policies necessarily need to include the ministries of economy, finances, and designing budget, but also the ministries that work for and with affected populations, especially in the case of the creation of a direction with a gender focus in the Ministry of Economy, which shows the need and how this demand is being received. So tax policy won't be built without gender focus and without people trained in this focus. So there are some comments on the chat, from the technical secretary of the American League of Civil Society Organizations. So just to continue the discussion after Nicole's presentation, I think, how can we work this with women, girls, and teenagers in lyrical ways so that these topics can be known for them? And in some way, this goes hand in hand of created mandates all the way from education. But that's on one part. And then I was thinking here very briefly, and we can share this through a link so we can continue discussion later on. Last year, there was a debate on the impact of exemptions and reductions to VAT in menstrual products based on Colombia's and Mexico's experiences, some initiatives in Argentina. And we were asking about how to reduce VAT in luxury products that is not discussed in years, and not menstrual products that is so hard to get this policy implemented. We also discussed what exemptions women are not using and that favor high income sections and sectors. Why, if this is a financial and corporate favoritism, why are they kept only revised for many years? But the same thing does not happen with the VAT of first need products. So there's something here on myths and narratives that allow this type of differences between the way tax measures are addressed. So once again, I consider how valuable it is to cross-sectionalize the agenda, the feminist agenda. that Corina was saying in order to provide to boost this agenda. So the idea is to further find synergies and further promote changes. I don't want to take more of your time. Now I'm going to pass the floor to Nicole so we can conclude in time. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today in this interesting discussion. I'd like to know if you can see my presentation. Yes, we can. But can you see it in presentation mode or? Well, we can see the next slide.
A ver, ahora sí, ¿ahora lo ven bien?
Is it better now? Well, I'm so glad to be in this exchange. And the first thing I'd like to say is that we want to share some of messages and data and proposal that at ETLAC we are promoting and discussing with ministries and other authorities in women mechanisms, as well as the ministries of economy, but also with women's and feminist organizations in the framework of the discussions that we've had in the regional conversation framework with Latin America and the Caribbean. So first of all, I'd like to tell you that this year, we have for the first time in the tax overview, which is an unprecedented edition, a tax seminar. And there was a sector that could allow us to analyze this. So yes, it is a working line that has been for many decades in the region and that has promoted movements, feminist movement. It is still under debate for its incorporation because of the authorities at a multilateral level. So this was already discussed a little bit by Veronica and Corina. For this audience, it's obvious that public policies and tax policies are not neutral and affect in a differentiated manner women and men. And it also affects producers, consumers, paid workers, all of them women, whether it's formal or informal. And these inequalities is the basis of our economy. And they are potentiated if there is a biased tax policy. So it is important to stress that in this region, tax collection is regressive. Half of collected taxes is indirect, as you very well said, but has a very preponderant part in collection. So it collects little and poorly. So it tends to reproduce inequalities. On the other side, for many decades, we have been showing that funding is insufficient to equality and women's rights, and the pandemic has generated needs to refinance and to fund, and hence we need to discuss how we will address the challenge in terms of income. On another side, I'd like to discuss that during 2020, the region made an important tax effort. If we analyze tax statistics, in 2020, has been the year where government spending has increased the most. If we compare 2019 with 2020, spending went from 24.4, and this has also been simultaneously in a reduction of income from 18.4 in 2019. It was reduced 0.5 of the GDP, and they ended being 17.9 in this period. And this reduction was explained mainly because of the reduction of tax activities. And what's important to discuss here is that spending increase was fundamental to partly mitigate social and economic impact by the pandemic. And as we can see here, the structure of total spending of the government in the last 3 years, we see that in every countries of the region that we have data for increased the current primary spending in 15.3 in 2018 to 18.6 in 2020. But there's also differences between countries and their regions, where we have South American countries that have been the ones that have increased primary current spending the most. And if we see this graph, we see what was the money spent on the most in subsidies and current transferences. So I think that this is very important to stress on. So from a gender perspective, we need to analyze this spending, because this spending not necessarily mean a reduction of inequality gaps. We see that countries have had different type of instruments, public spending, new instruments to support liquidity to SMEs, but we truly need to unravel and have disaggregated data to see who has been beneficiated by these tax efforts and what are the gender distributive effects, which is a little bit what we want to have some progress on in these months. Also, what we see here is that if we count the advertising of emergency plans that countries have done, they reached a percentage that you can see from January to April this year. So at least 1.2% of the GDP would be in average the advertising in emergency plans that countries are going to have to address. So from ECLAC, yes, it is very important to move forward in these plans, because yes, the effects of the pandemic continue, but we need to have a gender focus that can revert structural inequalities, because what we see today, a year after the pandemic started, we see that gender inequality gaps are deepening. So at ECLAC, we see that there are 4 new inequality causes: socioeconomic inequality, work, sexual division, power concentration, and patriarchal cultural patterns. So what we see here is that women are leaving workforces and a setback of at least 10 years in work participation of women, an increase of unemployment in women over men. We know that unemployment rate of women is always higher, but in this case, it reaches a 12%. And if we consider the levels of participation of 2019, this unemployment rate for women could reach 22%. On the other hand, we all know how this care load has been increased at home, and this is, of course, mostly done by women. And when we analyze the work participation of women and where they are, 1 out of 2 women in the region are in sectors that are related to loss of employment impacted, for example, paid domestic work, among others. So at ECLAC, we find it fundamental in this context today more than ever to be able to increase expenditure and investment with an equality lens. But as we've mentioned during this panel, also it is also important to increase collection, but in a progressive way. And human rights principles are more necessary than ever in order to prevent what we've learned from the past on recommending not to increase VAT, because people find it that better. However, it causes an impact of women that are overrepresented in poverty. So one of the proposals that we have at ECLAC is to have a tax system with gender equality to make opportunities equal and to open up for opportunities of labor and work participation for women. This new tax system has to promote gender equality for a transforming recovery, and we are completely aligned with what the rest of the panel members have mentioned, the importance to consider income and expenses, and of course, investment expense as three fundamental axes and basis for a transforming tax system. So on one hand, we need to increase tax collection on a progressive way. And here we have several proposals that are being promoted by CLAC. And as Corina is saying, today is a key time to be able to move forward some proposals. And yes, movements and different organizations have been promoting this some time ago, but this multiple crisis situation makes it even more necessary. So on one side, we need to mobilize additional public resources and increase progressiveness of tax collection, focusing on the direct taxes on physical on companies, industries, and those who have been having gain during the pandemic, technologies, economic sectors where there's a high share of women, but not enough because it's mainly for men. On the other side, there is an agenda which is key, which is eliminating tax evasion and illegal financial flows. We find this that it cannot happen anymore. In a necessary context of expenditure increase, it is unacceptable to lose year after year, day after day, taxes, because it reached $325 million in average. This is a 6% of the GDP in the region. So, of course, it is a volume that's way larger of what the countries are investing in social protection, for example. So there is also an agenda to reduce tax expenses and to reassess them. The tax and fiscal renouncing exemptions reaches 3.7% of the GDP. So we need to have more concrete case studies so we can go over them under a tax expense lens, so we can ensure that they are adhering to the SDGs or to the equality agenda, or maybe they are just causing a larger concentration of income and they are not causing any effective results for the rest of the economy. Another important area is to have some progress in international funding, access in favorable conditions for some countries in the region, especially the Caribbean, and to question the narrative of medium and upper income countries that are not having access to funding sources, so we can move forward in cooperation in tax matters, but also financial matters, so we can change these international and financial points. And we find it fundamental that countries move forward in key services to guarantee the rights of women, for example, violence, sexual and reproductive rights, care, and to have specific measures for employment protection and women employment, where women are concentrated, non and paid work, tourism, etc. And also something that's quite aligned with human rights is ensuring that these budget cutbacks that could happen in this context, or that are already happening in this context, in terms on how to finance pandemic expenses, do not affect financing of equal policies. On the other hand, in terms of investment, well, invest in economy of care, which is a multiplying factor, as well as participation of women. We are fostering this, and there are many countries in the region that are turning to this. And also to create affirmative action for women's participation for a sustainable recovery. Here we find fundamental, and ECLAC has defined many dynamic sectors for an equal recovery. Among them, we have health manufacturing, sustainable tourism, but also circular economy. And well, we have to move forward in a recovery effort that's transforming and that's oriented towards life sustainability. And we find that it is very important for tax policy role to be there. Access to public purchases. Also, this is a moment where it is important to move forward, where SMEs with women participation, women's share, can be privileged in access to hirings and public acquisitions in a context where we have to promote a public investment to transform from equality. And last but not least, I would like to share with you some elements that we find fundamental for civil society to know and from different movements to know. The Latin American governments have already approved different agreements in the framework of the Regional Conference on Women in Latin America and the Caribbean that include a human rights perspective in the design and implementation of tax policies. And we find this very important because actually I was reading some of the guidelines and principles of tax policies and human rights. And I was listening also to what you shared yesterday, and they are truly aligned with these guidelines. On one side, the governments throughout the region have approved that in the framework of this conference to design, implement, and assess tax policy under the right and gender perspective with available resources, including social, cultural, and economic rights, and also study the impact of tax policies before and after its application on gender agenda to prevent for them to have a negative aspect on equality and promote a coordinated effort between the ministries of women and budget entities. And also in terms of income, there are also several agreements that governments have agreed in the framework of this conference to expand collection for those who are wealthy with this type of direct taxes, to promote regional cooperation to prevent tax evasion. This liaison, we find it quite important. And for example, in the last regional conference on women that was carried out in Santiago in 2020 in January, countries also agreed to propose a regional coordination to prevent deleterious competence between countries so that we can increase export and promote investment. This work agenda on how to prevent a tax problem going downwards or a tax race downwards has to be done in cooperation between governments, corporations, and the UN system. In terms of spending, I don't want to bore you. I just want to tell you that there are agreements that have already been approved by these governments and that have this human rights focus on the importance of gender budgets to guarantee enough support and guarantee that adjustment measures or reporting measures adequate to human rights principles for non-discrimination, considering the criteria that the desk has promoted. And during the last conference, governments agreed to implement counter-cyclical policies to mitigate the effects and crises in women's lives. We haven't seen this same language and terminology in other conferences or intergovernment efforts at regional or global level, and we find it very important from the civil society to monitor if this is being implemented or not. And in the framework of counter-cyclical policies, governments agreed promoting policies that support economy in some sectors, such as care sectors. So at ECLAC, we are fully available to further cooperate in this work agenda to move forward a transforming recovery. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicole. It was a great presentation. So as a conclusion of this discussion, because we have gone over hour, there's agreements and there are concrete guidelines on the need to move forward towards a tax impact that promotes gender agenda. And once again, there are guidelines on how to do it. So now the challenge is to still advocate for these changes to happen. There's no more time for Q&A or for a debate. So if you want to continue discussion, we invite you at 13 hours Colombia to continue talking about these topics in a Twitter space where we are going to be with Andrea Guillem from CDC Ecuador, Estefania Chamber from Oxfam, Mexico, Daniela Mora. She's a Colombian politology specialist in public finances, and everyone that wants to join us. We will be continuing the debate there. And once again, thank you so much for being with us today. I would also like to thank my colleagues on the Initiative for Human Rights in Tax Policy for your support. And we invite you to follow these events that we will have throughout the week so we can strengthen advocacy towards a better tax justice. So once again, thank you so much. And I'm sorry for this reduced amount of time, but we have a lot of events throughout the week, so we want to truly respect everyone's time. Thank you so much.
Listo, vamos a darle paso a nuestra ilustradora.
So now we are going to share the illustrator's summary and her report.
Difundiremos la ilustración en nuestras redes sociales. Luego,
we will show the illustrator's work on our media, and we will continue with the next events. Thank you very much.
¿Sabes cuál es la relación entre la política fiscal y los derechos humanos? Los derechos humanos son los derechos que toda persona tiene por existir. La política fiscal es la forma en la que el gobierno obtiene los recursos para financiarse y cómo los gasta después. Esta política puede promover o generar retrocesos en la garantía de los derechos humanos. En América Latina, la región más desigual en el mundo, durante la pandemia por COVID-19, 73 multimillonarios aumentaron su fortuna en 42.000 millones de dólares, mientras se estima que 52 millones de personas ya han entrado en la pobreza. Esto demuestra que los países de América Latina no están cumpliendo con los acuerdos internacionales de derechos humanos que suscribieron. Si estos acuerdos internacionales fueran cumplidos, la política fiscal estaría al servicio de las personas y sus derechos en vez de restringirlos, que es lo que sucede hoy en la región. Con eso en mente, 7 organizaciones en América Latina se propusieron analizar estos acuerdos internacionales y aclarar cuáles son las implicaciones en derechos en materia de política fiscal. Así, surgen los 15 principios de derechos humanos en la política fiscal, que al ser aplicados por los gobiernos asegurarían que las políticas fiscales estén al servicio de los derechos. Algunas de las ideas en el documento aclaran que el Estado necesita recaudar impuestos de manera justa, de forma que los más ricos contribuyan más. Que las mujeres, las personas afrodescendientes, los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades que han sufrido discriminaciones deben tener prioridad en las decisiones del gasto. Y que la política fiscal debe ser transparente, participativa y sujeta a la rendición de cuentas. Si quieres saber más, visita nuestro sitio web